today we're going to talk a little bit about the updated information we have of the phenotyping portion of our Simon VIP project and talk a little bit just about what we've learned so far. So I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about what I'm going to go over today. So first we're going to do a brief review of the data collection procedures, and for those of you who have been to the family meetings in the past, those are just all the different tasks that you went through when you came to visit us. So we're going to talk about neurodevelopmental and psychiatric disorders, and those are some of the more common diagnoses that you may have heard about when you came in. And then cognitive profiles, and cognitive profiles would be something similar to the IQ or learning information that we found. And then we'll talk about some of the other disorders, issues, and strengths that we found in some of our kids with the 16p11.2 deletion duplication. I'll briefly mention the longitudinal portion of the study that we're doing and the online phase 2 study, as well as the future directions that we're going to be heading with the help of all the families that we've been interacting with. So I just wanted to start with a quick review for people who haven't been to some of these meetings about what is phenotyping. And phenotypes means simply refers to the documentation of observable characteristics or traits of an organism, and in this case, people, kids and adults and family members. So, it sounds simple, but in practice, as those of you who have visited us know, it can become slightly more complicated. So, first off, what all of our families did was they were contacted by our recruitment core at Emory. They had to go through a screening and give lots of medical records, and then they came to the phenotyping core either at Children's Hospital Boston, Texas Children's in Houston, or University of Washington in Seattle. And these were multiple-day visits with all the family members, lots and lots of testing, MRIs. We gave feedback and recommendations that had long discussions with the families. And then finally, what some of you did was you went to second-level imaging at UCSF or CHOP for 2 days of additional neurocognitive testing measures, sometimes fMRI, MEG, things like that. So the assessment measures that we used at those middle sites, the phenotyping sites, were diagnostic assessments that looked at particularly different diagnoses that are commonly seen in children with different genetic disorders, and particularly in 16p11.2 deletion duplication. I'm not going to go through every one of these measures, but you can see it's a pretty long list, and we want it to be as comprehensive as possible. So we did go through quite a few to look at things like ADHD or autism, other behavioral or psychiatric disorders. And then we did adaptive behaviors, and adaptive behaviors are things that measure what you can do day to day. So communication, social, and sort of just daily living skills. I talked a minute ago a little bit about cognitive skills, which are IQ or problem-solving measures. And then we looked at motor skills and language skills, and we did a parental stress measure because we do find that sometimes, parents can be under a lot of stress, particularly if they're worried about their children, so we wanted to measure that. We looked at learning or achievement, so that's just how well the kids were doing in school for those of our families who had children who were in sort of regular academic classrooms. We looked at repetitive behaviors, and then we did a very detailed history. We looked at executive function. If you went to the second site, that third thing that you saw earlier at either UCSF, for the imaging, you would do the executive functioning, and of course we did a medical piece as well. So what we were looking for, as I sort of alluded to, was a wide range of disorders, but particularly at those neurodevelopmental and psychiatric disorders. And so for neurodevelopmental disorders and psychiatric disorders, neurodevelopmental are things like problem-solving difficulty, learning difficulty, things like that. Psychiatric disorders are specific psychiatric issues. You might think of depression or anxiety or psychiatric things like schizophrenia. And what we did is we used family members as a comparison. So we asked all the families to come in because we used the extensive testing data that was completed by family members to try to understand which areas of strengths and difficulties tended to run in families and which were more likely to be related to the deletion or the duplication. And family member data, particularly from siblings, is really helpful for comparison, and this is because they have many of the same genes and they're raised in a similar environment, and so things like cognitive ability tend to be similar in brothers and sisters unless something else had happened or is going on. And so, as I started to allude to, the neurodevelopmental disorders that we tested for are a group of conditions that have an onset in the developmental period, so often before a child even enters grade school, and they can produce impairments of personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning, and they refer to a wide range of issues. I mentioned learning disorders, but also just things that you may have heard of, like executive functioning, which that means your ability to sort of plan and organize information, and global impairments of social skills or intelligence. And sometimes we think about that as things like autism, which I mentioned earlier, or intellectual disability, which used to be called mental retardation. And the thing that's important to remember is some of these things co-occur. So that means that you might have more than one thing going on at one time. And in fact, frequently that can happen. Some specific types is the intellectual disability, learning disorder, motor skills, developmental coordination disorder, communication disorders, which is, I hadn't mentioned earlier, but is things that are difficult with your language, so either receptive language, which is understanding language, or expressive language, which is speaking. And autism spectrum disorders, I don't think I mentioned ADHD or disruptive behavior disorders, and of course tic disorders. And psychiatric disorders can be trickier to diagnose. So, like I mentioned, the anxiety or depression or even schizophrenia, also mood disorders, but they sometimes don't start until a little later or can be a little difficult to separate out, particularly with kids who aren't talking very much and so can't tell you how they're feeling. And then schizophrenia actually often isn't even seen until early adulthood. You might see a few things when kids are younger, but really the full-blown symptoms don't emerge until kids are older. So let's go into what we found in our particular group. And so the rates of neurodevelopmental and psychiatric disorders in our group of people who have 16p11.2 deletion and duplication. So the following slide is going to show the percent of individuals who were given a diagnosis, so meaning they had enough difficulty in a specific area that it was associated with significant distress or disability. So that's not to say there weren't other children who could have had some symptoms that didn't meet criteria or full criteria for the diagnosis. And so as we know, a lot of these things can be on a continuum, so you can have some anxiety, but you might not meet criteria for anxiety disorder because it's not causing you such significant distress or interfering with your day-to-day life. And so that's how we usually separate or just having some symptoms or some issues or difficulty from having an actual diagnosis. So what we found for people who had the deletion, the children who had the deletion, is that when they compare them to their siblings, and you can see above we had 110 kids who had a deletion and 66 siblings, and that pretty much across the board there was much higher rate of these diagnoses in children who had the deletion. And you can see the percentages there. I don't have to go through them all, but you can see that particularly language, so articulation, language issues, coordination issues, we certainly had a much higher rate of autism spectrum disorders compared to what you would see in sort of the general population or in the siblings. And so also we can see pretty elevated ADHD, but across the board there was a risk. And as I said before, and I'll show you on the next slide, there was a lot of overlap. So this isn't just like one child who had ADHD and then another child who had something else, but often kids had more than one diagnosis. So here you see developmental coordination disorder, which is a motor disorder overlapping with language or a phonological processing disorder, and there was lots of overlap there. And then for the duplication, you see sort of a similar picture, slightly less overall, but still significantly higher than the comparison siblings, which were very low overall. And again, some of the highest things were intellectual disability, some motor coordination, language issues. ASD was quite elevated. And then again, on the next slide, you see that similarly that they tended to have more than one diagnosis, and diagnoses tended to overlap. So again, you don't typically have just one diagnosis, you might have more than one. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit more, switch gears a little into what is intellectual or cognitive ability. So this can also sometimes be referred to as general intelligence, and it's just the ability to think about ideas, analyze situations, solve problems. And we measure it through various types of intelligence tests or IQ tests. And usually that's separated into two types of intelligence, what we call verbal intelligence, understanding, processing, using language, and nonverbal intelligence, your ability to sort of solve nonverbal or pictorial or pattern problem solving type things. And what we found is that there are cognitive challenges for both deletions and duplications across verbal and nonverbal domains, but there was certainly substantial variability. So the performance, though, what was important is it's below the mean, so the average of the population, and below family members. So typically when we talk about cognitive skills are usually similar to what your other family members' cognitive ability is. And the fact that our kids have much lower, in most instances, cognitive ability means that it has something to do with their deletion or duplication, because otherwise they probably would have had, we can't say for 100% certainty, but usually, like I said, typically you would have similar cognitive ability to your other people in your family. And what we found is they had similar challenges in other cognitive-related areas. So if you have low problem solving, low IQ, it often impacts your daily living skills and your school ability. So stuff like reading and math, so that's often impacted. And we did find that those things were difficult in our kids. So here's just a little visual to show you some of the differences. And if you look up on the orange here, that would be the siblings, and you see, for example, if you look all the way to the left, that's probably the best one to look at, which is full-scale IQ, so it's just like your overall IQ, and for siblings, it was 106. Now, for cognitive scores, 100, unlike when you take a test, 100 isn't the best you can get. 100 is average, and that's what we would expect, is that most people are average range, and that would be the siblings. But if you look at the blue and the red, the average is around in the 80s, and that is lower than we would anticipate and lower than the siblings overall. But you can see the little black line that kind of goes up and down are called whiskers, and it means that there's a lot of variability, right? So you see a lot of variability, but overall there's certainly a reduction in IQ scores. So just to sort of summarize, the full-scale IQ for our duplications, the overall IQ is about an 80, the deletions is 86. And as we were talking about the diagnoses, the number of diagnoses, so the people who had one or more for the duplications was 80%, and for the deletions it was 95%. And then ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, for the duplications it was 20% of individuals, and for the deletions 24% of individuals, which is higher than what we would expect in the normal population, and certainly much higher than we saw in the siblings. And then the most frequent diagnoses for kids with a duplication was intellectual disability, developmental coordination disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and autism. For deletions, it was speech-sound disorder, developmental coordination disorder, and overall just language disorders in general. And then below that is just, we'll talk a little bit more about repetitive behaviors. Now, repetitive behaviors are things that might look a little bit like tics or flapping or other unusual behaviors that you just see more often than you would expect in a child. And we did see these kind of behaviors at a higher level in the duplications and the deletions. And so this is where we're going to talk a little bit more about this. And so lining up items, overly interested in the sight, feel, smell, or taste of items. And the nice thing is that what we did in the Simon's VIP is we actually developed this measure. It's a new measure that we used on all the kids to measure these sort of interesting and unusual behaviors, and it helps us do what we call standardize. So make sure that the measure is able to do a good job in measuring these behaviors, and we were able to do that. And underneath here it says the final measure and paper will be out this summer. So, of course, I'm recording this a little bit after the first time we presented, and the behavior and sensory interest questionnaire has been published, and we're happy to share that with people. And as you can see here, the children with ASD and non-ASD, because in repetitive and otherwise unusual behaviors, we do tend to see this even more in kids with autism spectrum disorder, and this is how these behaviors have sort of become noted and more notable. But interestingly, what we see in kids with 16p11.2, and here we have the duplication, is that even in kids without the diagnosis of ASD, we see very high rates of these behaviors, and all of these are significantly higher than in the siblings, where the behaviors are almost at zero across the board. So things like I said already, repeating things or flapping or interested in sort of sensory, smelling, tasting, looking at things. Also doing interesting or unusual things with your language, like repeating over and over things people say or things people heard, is just seen much more frequently in our kids who have the deletion duplication. Again, similarly with the deletion, I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but again, just much higher than the siblings in the general population, and whether you have a diagnosis of autism or not, it's still quite high. So what we also found, and we talked a lot with family members about this, and certainly have been talking about it over the years, are the challenging behaviors that we see. And the behavior challenges often do increase with language impairments, cognitive deficits, and neurodevelopmental disorders. And that's, sort of not just in our study, but just across the board. But certainly we saw that in our study as well. And what's difficult, of course, is that behavior challenges can significantly impact quality of life. So we wanted to make sure that we've talked a lot to families about potential resources, and most families that have come into our sites, we've talked about expert support, psychologists with expertise in neurodevelopmental disorders, experts in behavioral therapies, and particularly what we call applied behavior analysis, which I'm not going to get into too much today, but we're happy to talk to people about later. And, of course, there's a number of really good books. I can't sort of list them all here, but for trying to deal with challenging behaviors, these are just 3, but of course some of them are dependent on specific behaviors that your child is facing, and we're happy to talk to you more about those as well. So just to sort of move along a little, we, as you may know, we're also doing a longitudinal study, and longitudinal just means over time, and that's why everyone came to the site for multiple visits over the years, and also it was just fantastic getting to know the families, and seeing these kids grow up was really, really amazing for all of us, but it also certainly helped us with research. And so we started looking at this data. It's still preliminary. The nice thing is we've looked at growth over time, lots of growth in our kids. It looks like a lot of them are getting really nice services. We see their cognitive ability increase, and sometimes that gap between themselves and their peers even starts to lessen over time. We are seeing gains in both sections of verbal that I was talking about, as well as the nonverbal, but particularly the verbal, since the kids often have language difficulties that are pretty significant. It is very nice to see that there's strong gains and often a closing of that gap in verbal abilities. And we hope to certainly see a continued closing of the gap between the kids with 16p11.2 deletion and duplication and their peers with that appropriate intensive intervention. And this is sort of just a visual picture of how that's going. Each little line here is a child in our study. If the line is flat, that means that growth is appropriate, so it continues over time, the same as it's been going along. And if it goes up, it means that they're actually increasing their rate of learning over time. You see a lot of the kids are actually really improving and increasing their rate of learning over time. The next thing I'd like to talk about is sort of what we're doing next. And at this point, I think a lot of you already know about the online study, and many of you have participated in it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, and I know Wendy's slides actually went through this a bit, but we do really encourage everyone to keep involved in the study and helping us to keep getting information about the kids so we can do more longitudinal studies and analyses to see how the kids, and if that pace of learning continues to keep catching up over time. So the phase 1 would be to register, and then you do a bunch of surveys and a bunch of different online tests, and there's a phone call and some follow-up. And so this is to help us to reach even more families than not just the families that were in the sites, the study where you went to the sites, but to actually reach even more families who may not have been able to attend a site because of whatever difficulty they may have had. And so this is helping us to get more information to help us understand this genetic syndrome. And here it is. This is just a little view of what you would see if you looked online. And then in general, we did want to just mention that, that we found certainly that a lot of our kids are doing nicely and sort of really gaining lots of skills, but we want to make sure that for the families who are coming down the pike, that if you do have a deletion or duplication, the children are certainly at higher risk for a wide range of developmental issues. Early assessment is certainly essential, and early intensive intervention is best, but certainly the kids need intervention over time, and sometimes their needs change because they're progressing, but still having intensive intervention can be very good. Parents need often to be advocates for the services, and the issues and interventions change, and so regular reassessment for children with any concerns is certainly vital. So for future directions, we're hoping to continue to set up best practice for clinical, psychological, and medical evaluation. We've already written a few statements on how to best talk to pediatricians and other individuals that may be serving the children who have 16p11.2 deletion duplication, so they know sort of what the risks are and what the best things are to make sure that they're diagnosed and supported and followed correctly. We want to do more analysis to thoroughly understand the current data, and we want to continue to do longitudinal studies to understand the course of development, as well as do our online follow-up of families. And we just wanted to, of course, thank you for your time and energy and commitment to helping and understand 16p11.2 deletion duplication syndrome. Thanks again.